There is no history of art without a history of architecture. Indeed, to a great extent, the history of art is the history of art's relationship to its surrounding architectural setting. Whether private or public, religious or secular, buildings have shaped the function and the display of art over time. In this lecture, I'll consider the architecture of antiquity, that of Greece and Rome. But why do we put them together under the banner of antiquity? Well, to a great extent, Roman architecture is informed by and adapted the principles set out in classical Greece. So let's begin where it all started. The Roman architect-engineer Vitruvius once wrote that architecture consists of order, arrangement, proportion, symmetry, propriety, and economy. He might as well have been talking about this building, the Parthenon, in Athens. This building was shaped and defined by mathematical ratios. Both the number of columns and the ratio of width to length were shaped by mathematical principles, and they reflected the rationality of the culture who bore them. The meaning of classical architecture is defined by those principles of rationality, symmetry, balance, harmony, and order that were characteristic of the Parthenon. But here you can see a building that isn't classical, but in fact neoclassical or new classical. It was completed in the 17th century, and it's St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, the largest Christian church in the world. And yet, despite its Christian function, it assimilates the principles of classicism in order to enhance its sense of stability, sophistication, and status. The knowledge of the classical past informs the meaning of this Christian structure. And that tells you all you need to know about the lingering importance of classicism over time. But how do we recognize a classical building? Well, a classical building is one whose decorative elements derive directly or indirectly from the architectural vocabulary of the ancient world, that of classical Greece and Rome. However, the aim of classical architecture has always been to achieve a harmony of parts through accurate and consistent structural proportions. So it's a twofold system, both decorative and structural. In other words, to be a building must be harmonious in its proportions and look classical. But how did classical architecture come to be? Where did it derive from? Well, the stone temples of classical Greece are believed to have their origin in wooden prototypes. And you can see here in this detail how the features associated with classical style seem to inherit the principles of wooden post construction. Greek temples, like Egyptian temples before them, used basic post and lintel construction, sometimes referred to as a trabeated system. And here in this image of Paestum in southern Italy, which is another example of classical Greek architecture spreading beyond the Greek peninsula, you can see that this structure is divided into bays on the horizontal. It's a system of repeating equal units. But it's also a system designed for an observer, suited to an aesthetic observation. Entasis is the outward bulging in the middle of classical columns. It may originally have imitated the effect of compression in wooden post, but it serves as a kind of optical correction to the apparent decreased width of columns in bright sunlight, especially notable at the corners of temples. So classical temples are not simply comprised of perfect mathematical ratios. Rather, they're adapted to human consideration. It's a human-centered construction system. The Parthenon embodies classical Greek architecture in its purest form, and it introduces some fundamental structural elements and decorative features that we've come to associate with classicism. It's planned on a raised platform known as a stylobate, and its columns are encased and superposed with a horizontal superstructure known as the entablature. But this building is not simply a structural monument. It's also a site of arts display, and you can see both on the west and the east ends pediments housing relief sculpture, displaying the mythologies of Athena's birth and her triumph over Poseidon for rule in Attica. Despite its scale, the Parthenon was not designed to hold a large congregation. Rather, it was designed to hold the image of the goddess herself, Athena Parthenos. The building glorifies Athens, and it honors its divine protectress. With its repeating units, it also represents equality of free citizens within democratic society in Greece. However, this is not simply a statement of equal units. In fact, it's an illusion of equality, in much the same way that democracy is freedom with constraints. Situated on the Acropolis in Athens, the Parthenon embodies the highest flourishing of classical Greek society. This is the society that brought us the Greek tragedies of Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles, as well as our capacity for abstract reasoning, manifest in the figure of Socrates. So is the Parthenon a statement of democracy, or was it actually a naked act of tyranny on the part of the Athenian state? Pericles, the leader of the Athenian state, transferred the treasury of the Delian League, the league set up to protect Greece, from the original location on Delos to Athens. The treasury was used to fund architectural projects like those that you see before you here. So the history of the Parthenon is not all that it seems. Indeed, the history of art and architecture is not a clear and easy narrative. But what's this all about? Well, ultimately, your job is to analyze buildings. When I consider a new building, I always consider the plan first. And you can see here that the plan of the Parthenon is what's known as a peripteral plan, meaning it's surrounded on all sides by columns. You can see here the cella or naos, which was the temple used to house the image of the goddess. The opisthodomos is the place where the money was stored. Once you've considered the plan, then it's time to consider the exterior elevation. This happens to be a front facade, a front elevation, but you might as easily talk about a side elevation too. What words do you use when you're considering a building like this? Well, balance, harmony, and order are all good places to start, but it's the repetition of the features, the balance of horizontals and verticals, that make this a quintessentially classical structure. Once I've considered the plan and the elevation, now it's time for the decoration. And as you can see on the Parthenon, the frieze, that middle unit of the entablature, is comprised of triglyphs and metopes. Triglyphs are the tripartite vertical units that are here interspersed with relief carvings. The Parthenon is decorated with images of the battles of Lapiths and centaurs, of the gods and the giants. The symbolism is one of civilization versus savagery. Once again, the triumph of Athens over its outsiders. But who was responsible for codifying classical architecture into a system? Vitruvius was a Roman architect-engineer who worked for Caesar Augustus, and his publication of De Architectura codified Greek and Roman architecture into a system that was both structural and decorative. According to Vitruvius, without symmetry and proportion, no temple can have a regular plan worked out after the fashion of the members of a well-shaped body. Vitruvius felt that man was the measure of all things. See, he was a Roman architect working in the spirit of classical Greek philosophers like Protagoras. Renaissance scholars and artists such as Leonardo da Vinci were inspired by the humanistic model of architecture and art, the notion of man as the basis for harmony and symmetry. According to Vitruvius, proportion consists in taking a fixed module both for the parts of the building and for the whole. It's a structural system that he was writing down. And the width of the diameter of a column, such as these, dictated the proportions of the overall structure. But Vitruvius' system was also a decorative one, and it codified the classical orders. What are these orders? Well, here you can see in the middle the three original Greek orders: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. According to Vitruvius, the Doric was associated with masculinity, and in Greek style, it doesn't have a base, and it's squat in proportion. The Ionic is more elegant and taller. And you can see here it has these curving volutes at the top in the capital. The capital is the element at the top of a column, which adds a decorative flourish. The third, the Corinthian, was based on the proportions and the elegance of a young maiden. So the classical orders had their own mythology, and they were decorative, but they were also gendered. And to a great extent, Vitruvius is responsible for gendering the history of architecture. You can see on the ends here, the Tuscan and the Composite order are additions by the Romans to the Greek original orders. So Vitruvius' system was both structural and decorative, and it defined classical architecture afterwards. The Colosseum is not a trabeated structure anymore, but an arcuated one. And here you can see that the arch structure allowed the Romans to build much higher, more monumental public structures, such as the Flavian Amphitheatre, the Colosseum. It was the Roman general Marcellus in 211 BC who sacked the city of Syracuse in Sicily. This was a Greek city that transformed Roman society by its increasing awareness of Greek prototypes in art and architecture. The artistic treasures from the city that Marcellus brought back to Rome as spoils had a dazzling effect on some Romans and caused others to recoil in conservative outrage. Prior to this, Rome neither had nor even knew of these exquisite and refined things. Rather, it was full of barbaric weapons and bloody spoils, says Plutarch, in a famous passage that undoubtedly exaggerates Rome's lack of culture, but captures the essence of a cultural confrontation that had begun in earnest. The Romans blame Marcellus because he'd filmed the Roman people who had hitherto been accustomed to fighting or farming and had no experience with a life of softness and ease, with a taste for leisure and idle talk, affecting urbane opinions about the arts and about artists, even to the point of wasting the better part of a day on such things. But Marcellus, far from sharing his opinion, proclaimed proudly, even before the Greeks, that he had taught the Romans to respect and marvel at the beautiful and wondrous works of Greece. That's Plutarch's view on the Roman general Marcellus. But clearly, this is a crucial development in the history of Rome, which used the classical Greek prototypes to elevate its status intellectually. But here you can see that the language of classical Greek architecture has been used in the details as well. If you look closely, you can see that this construction is what's known as an example of superimposed orders, superimposition. If you look closely, we have Corinthian over Ionic over Doric. And in this case, the columns are not freestanding in the round, but engaged or attached to the pillars of the arches behind them. So the Romans were adapting Greek forms to new purposes. Indeed, on the top level of the Colosseum, you can see not columns anymore, but pilasters. These are flat, decorative columns, which were a new element, a decorative element, which adapted and elevated the educated spirit of classical Greek antiquity for the Roman context. The dome structure of the Pantheon is a tribute to Roman ingenuity, but its portico shows the extent to which, for the Romans, the Greek language, the classical orders, served as an aesthetic counterbalance to their new structural developments. If we move inside, we can see the magnificent oculus at the center of the enormous rotunda, the round space, topped by a concrete dome, hemispherical, and therefore assuming within itself all of that divine Platonic perfection that the Greeks would have marveled at. The Pantheon, which literally means a temple dedicated to all the gods, reflects the syncretistic nature of the Roman religious establishment. Yet, the oculus also unifies that logic, creating a vertical ascent and a triumph of Roman ingenuity over Greek precedent. The history of classical architecture is a hybrid one, born of structure and decoration. And the Romans adapted and adjusted Greek prototypes to new, more ambitious functions. Your task for this week is to learn the key architectural features of classical antiquity. Here they are. You're welcome.